right, Kelley Dupps, thank you for joining me today. You're the Director of Inclusive Policy and Advocacy for the Action Alliance, which champions inclusivity in youth education. And you've been in advocacy and political communications for about 25 years. About 10 of those years, you were at Planned Parenthood Arizona, and you worked there like right up until around the time the state Supreme Court made that big ruling on the 15-week abortion ban. What was it like? What was your career like at that time? And did you expect the court to rule like it did?
Um, I mean, the short answer is yes, I totally expected the court just based on who's on there, based on why they were put on there, and by the politicians that put them on there, right? So that ruling wasn't necessarily a shock, but my career at Planned Parenthood was like a lot, right? Dealing with, kind of the real big push from the Republicans and, after, right as Brewer got into office and they were just kind of going to go and just pass everything. And Planned Parenthood's advocacy department was like me and my boss, right? It wasn't like a robust department that, we built it out to be. And so it was kind of like, just getting hit with sorry,
That's
dealing with dogs and three children in summer break is
Oh,
always.
no, that's okay. No problem at all.
But yeah, no, just dealing with the fire hose that was abortion advocacy and dealing with the Center for Arizona Policy. I mean, they were passing two, three, four bills a session, right, that regulated, you know, you know, abortion access out of reach for many
Yeah.
patients. And so it was just really frustrating, but also at the same time, today it's very telling because those same people are using the same playbook to limit gender affirming care for trans people. And so it's just kind of like very, you know, I was there I mean, I think, you often hear that you are right where you're supposed to be in the universe. And it really is telling to make sure that like, yeah, no, I know what they're going to do. I see that playbook and it's often the same people, right? That want to limit patient-led, free thinking, free speech kind of things, it's just in the same vein, gender affirming care and abortion policy.
Yeah, the playbook often stays the same.
It does.
So, walk me through your decision to move from Planned Parenthood to the Education Action Alliance.
Yeah, throughout my career, I'd worked for lots of different advocacy areas, right? I worked for animal welfare and protection. I worked for, cancer protection and care, in lesbian and gay communities, right? So, serving at Planned Parenthood in all of the different spaces that the advocacy department allowed me to, I was just really ready to kind of go do something different. Being on reproductive health and sexual advocacy is a lot and it's all the time and there's always a target on your back, and so really wanting to do something else. And at the time, see, Education Action Alliance used to be Glisson, Arizona, and so really wanting to still stay in the advocacy community, but really have a different focus. And so moving over to Education Action Alliance, we still work in a lot of spaces with gender affirming care and making sure that, youth are able to access both physical and mental health care. But also, really making sure that, like, in the education space, that inclusion is a value, right? Teachers can't look at their classrooms and say, oh, there's the two queer kids in my class, right? You can't tell. So creating environments of inclusion benefit all students and making sure that affirming educators have that support, to be able to do that, because oftentimes they become a target of their own administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And given you've worked across so many advocacy spaces like reproductive rights, LGBTQ inclusion, education, is there something for you that connects all this work for you? Like a reason you were drawn to these specific advocacy roles?
I think, it's a profound sense of fairness. And, in the world, I often heard as a young person, well, the world's not fair. And my response is, well, it should be. And so, really, in every space, understanding that many of these policies create, unfair playing fields for marginalized communities. And, as a trans person, I belong to a marginalized community, but also understanding the privilege that I have as a white person. And so, really bringing those intersections to these spaces is really important. So, it's that profound sense of that things should be fair and that we could make them fair. And so it's really that push to make things fair. And, advocacy, I think, has changed over the years, right? From, just protesting and showing up to City Hall to, really the mass communication campaigns that we've had to really the one-on-one, like, this person cannot unhear my story. And storytelling is going to be the biggest thing that we have going forward because it's really, that lived experience that cannot be erased.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you have a lot of lived experience too, in working in this field of advocacy. How does being a transgender man influence your approach and experience of public policy?
I think it's, that understanding of how policy can be used to other people and really used to target individuals. As a transgender man right now, I identify a lot with those undocumented people, right? Because my documentation does not match my lived experience. And so I'm unable to really travel outside of the country. I'm unable to get a passport. I am very lucky to be able to be employed, and have access to health benefits and things like that, because those are things that are really not able to be afforded to people who don't have appropriate documentation. And so it's just bringing these different intersections that people often will miss of like why that matters so much. And especially, in a space like education where everyone has the constitutional right to education, and all the barriers that are kind of put in front of folks. And in Arizona, we have a very unique landscape from, voucher-led programs to homeschooling to public school to charter schools to where are those rights afforded to students? And, how are we able to make sure that equity and equality is, permeated through every system of education? And so it's really, incumbent upon us to make sure that queer students are seen and valued and really, given every opportunity to thrive because we want them to grow up and transition into adulthood, just like every other high school graduate, right? We want them to go off and live their life and change the world. And, that's really just kind of the goal of all of this is to ensure that folks are able to feel like they belong so they can go out into the world and create that sense for other people.
Yeah, and I think right now in the, most of the news we see regarding LGBTQ, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in schools is like, yeah, pride flags, or we're banning, books with gay couples in them, stuff like that. Is there any overlooked barrier that LGBTQ students face in Arizona school today that you don't think really gets enough attention?
I mean, I think it's all the things, right? Like it's just this heightened focus on your life. And think of a teenager. Teenagers do not want grown-ups paying attention to their life any more than they have to, right? And suddenly you have a lot of grown-ups up in your business. And so young people are like, hey, now, I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to be a regular kid going to school. And that means having access to bathrooms, right? That means having access to extracurricular activities, all of the things that are afforded to cisgendered and heterosexual peers. And so I think it's just really looking at all of those systems and saying, if this student was cisgender and heterosexual, would be we treating them this way? And so I think it's really looking at those, possibilities for transgender and non-binary students to be able to say you belong here just like anybody else, and you can do sports if you want to. You can do drama club if you want to. Just really affording them all of these different kinds of opportunities, because what we often hear is that transgender young people are threats, right? That they are threats in bathrooms, they are threats on school teams, they are threats in locker rooms. And the fact is that they're not. Transgender youth are young people who are just trying to live their lives, just like any other young person. And so it's really, I think, creating that normalcy of like just trusting and believing in people who say they are who they are, and not having to question everything and quote, be right or, understand everything. Because as humans, we're not going to understand everything about someone else, but we can respect their journey and try to go along with them in the spaces that we share.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I wonder, so I'm wondering what your take on this is when we see things like bathroom pronoun bills being legislated, that was at the state capitol this session, sessions before. How much of that, from your perspective, do you think is genuine concerns for these people? How much is just like culture wars feeding into a narrative?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just, I mean, we've seen over a decade of bathroom bills being put out, right? It's really a political grift that politicians can pull out that bathroom ban and say, hey, look, I tried to push this extreme regulation on this very small minority of students, and you should reelect me. You should give me money. You should sign my petition to get me back on the ballot. And it's really exploiting that kind of fear and unknown to folks who may not have met a transgender person or understand what it's like to be a transgender student. And so I think it's really that political grift that is so frustrating, right? We know that the governor is going to veto these kind of flagrant bills that come across her desk. And so making sure that, our community understands that this is the purpose of these bills, that it's really to kind of make sure that the harm is done during the legislative process. And so that we're prepared to, offer testimony in different ways, making sure that, folks don't come up to the Capitol thinking that they're going to meet a bunch of good faith arguments from the other side, that that's not going to happen, that they're going to hear a lot of mis and disinformation, and how that really impacts the community. So making sure that we're prepared for that, but also that we're also prepared to call out what this political grift does, not only for the politicians that benefit from it, but also from our community who has to come out and, you know, take these kinds of bills head on to say, no, these are lies, this is misinformation, and try to correct it along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know things are particularly hostile right now, but you've advocated through a lot of politically hostile environments of different flavors. What keeps you from burning out?
Part of it is, I'm lucky enough to have a spouse and children who do not care really about politics, right? They hear
Right.
about, some of the things in the news, but that helps me. I also have several dogs, many dogs, that also do not care about politics, and so I think that is helpful in keeping me grounded, but also and also knowing how important it is. My wife and I 7 years ago adopted three kids from Arizona's foster care, and so just understanding the trauma that comes with adoption, the joy that comes with adoption as well, and being able to, share our lives together, and showing what families built with love and just transparent communication is awesome. And so I'm lucky in that way, right? To be able to kind of have both worlds of like I get to kind of try to disconnect, as hard as that is, and I also get to see how important these things are, and in the different tiers of policy that I work in, like everything I look at is kind of a different policy thing. When I was, a small child, I would be like, why is it this way? Why aren't we doing things this way? And, grown-ups didn't really like my my questions. And as I got older, more grown-ups didn't like my questions. So it's really, being able to, have kids that, you can say questioning is important. Grown-ups don't know everything. And, it's hard to raise kids like that because then they question you and, you don't know everything. So
Yeah.
it's quite a circle. But yeah, I'm really lucky that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think any of your kids will ever go into politics?
Maybe like one of them should like she would be president.
Oh,
It's very cute. My oldest wrote an essay when she was in first grade about how she would never want to be president because like the people are too mean to you and it's a lot of hard work and she's not really into that. So there's one that probably won't and then one that should that would change the world. But the thing with having kids is it's important that they follow their dreams and not mine. So I just want them to be humane and happy people. And so far we're doing well.
that's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, I have some five sort of rapid fire, sort of less serious questions for you. You're ready?
Yeah.
Okay. First up, what is the craziest thing you've ever seen a school board do?
Oh my goodness. So the gender dysphoria policy in Mesa was pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Like a lot of the different layers of the medicalization and kind of othering of students who would suffer from that. So that's pretty crazy. I think the other crazy thing just legislatively is the abortion reversal law that was passed that you could like go to your doctor and get a bunch of progesterone and reverse your abortion by pill, which was nuts. I never was seeing that coming. And so as a person who tries to really anticipate the opposition, like that was nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we just talked about sort of looking at people who aren't as politically involved, kind of fresh breath of fresh air, who's your current favorite politician that you could really get on board with?
My goodness. Let me see. Politicians are not my favorite people.
I know it's
So
a hard question.
I know, because I'm like, well, I love like Brian Garcia.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, started out as a school board member. So I really love that. Um, like I always love Mayor Pete. So like I have a range of folks that I appreciate, but then I'm like, okay, I don't want this, but I'm waiting for you to let me down, right?
Yes.
Because I think as an advocate, you're always pushing for more. And what you get is never enough, right? Because by the time you get it, you've been asking for 10 years. And so that's kind of, the context that we often work in is that thank you, and now I need more. Because our communities are often just neglected so much that by the time there's any policy focus, like we are strapped, right? There's no money. But we have billions of dollars for either, vouchers or bombs. And so that's really frustrating to like communities who have been neglected to say, oh, you have to wait your turn. Or we'll have a bake sale and raise some money.
Yeah.
And so really, I think, always kind of having that kind of drive is probably distasteful to many politicians of like, I'm trying so hard to get you what you need and it's never enough. And so I think it, really when you focus it on the community and focus it on the people that need that need the power that they don't have, it's really just kind of, that's what really kind of drives all of the work, I think, is really centering it on that. So politicians are not my fave.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good word. You appreciate them. I don't
Yes,
think
yes.
there's such thing as a perfect politician, but okay. Can you remember the first queer icon that sort of caught your attention when you were younger?
Yeah, it was probably Harvey Milk.
Oh,
I'm old enough to like kind of remember that. But yeah, it was probably Harvey Milk. Um,
sorry.
the other person would be Allen Ginsberg.
Okay.
Just, like I something was mentioned on the TV and my parents had some comment about Alan because, he was kind of a flamboyant character of their time as well. So those would be probably my two ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I spoke to you before. I was writing a story about the new age verification for online porn that's going into effect in Arizona. And I've seen you quoted in the press quite a lot. Is there a favorite story you've read that you've been quoted in?
Ooh. I mean, honestly, like the recent one of like, big whoop. I'm not really impressed with, like these are the things that the governor should be, kind of focused on. But then, these insidious bills, these book bans, these digital erasure bills seem to just either slip by or just actively get, enacted, which is really frustrating that feel like it kind of slips through the cracks of like kind of the title of the bill and kind of fanfare of the bill doesn't always take into account what else gets swept into the bill. And so I think that's been kind of a frustration and kind of a, that just shows we need an adjustment in our advocacy to really focus and educate folks on what these bills actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. And last question for you. What is the weirdest or most unexpected place you've had a great political conversation?
So West Palm Beach,
Okay.
Florida. Um, I went canvassing there a very long time ago for John Kerry for president, so you know how old I am. But like in these places where they, voters had not been talked to by my party or the party I was with at the time. Um, and really just having a lot of great conversations of like why voting is important, right? This was before a lot of the, Help America Vote Act or anything like that, but it was really, these were um, you know, inactive or, sporadic voters at best. And so, we were in trailer parks and some, rundown parts of West Palm Beach County talking to voters, having, people open their doors with guns and, rifles and, like for
Uh,
real, like that's because most folks aren't coming to their door to talk to them about democracy, right? Most of them weren't coming to say, hey, do you know that there's an election? So it was a really, like, I think profound for me that it works when you talk to people and when you engage them and you say, hey, tell me about why you vote. Tell me about why you think this is important. You get to understand people at a different level. And it's that engagement that, for me, it's like, yes, I want you to vote my way, but I want you to vote.
yeah.
I want you to be engaged. And if it means you're voting the opposite direction from me, well, then welcome to America. Like that's what this is. That's what this is. And that's really, so that was pretty profound for me, to be able to kind of, in many of these instances, be in some not so great circumstances, and really come away with like a shared understanding of why civic engagement, why voting, why, really being a part of democracy is important.
Yeah. That sounds like a very profound experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all I had for you, Kelly. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that was easy.
Good. Okay, well, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
You bet. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.